Welcome everyone to the January 13th, 2022 meeting of the INC Transportation Committee. The INC Transportation Committee is open to everyone in Denver. We bring people together from neighborhoods and organizations across the city to raise our level of knowledge about what's happening in our transforming world of transportation. We always try to bring a number of topics that are timely and are relevant to folks in the neighborhood, but also to connect us directly with the folks doing the work. And tonight we have a great lineup for that. We have, starting with David Pulsipher, Complete Streets. Now, some time ago, about a year ago, we had a presentation on the Complete Streets design guidelines. And those were just being wrapped up, and I would say they were very well received. But to have effect, they need to be translated into standards and guidelines that the engineers will use and the private sector will use. So we'll hear about that first. Then, as you can see from the agenda, we have new parking meter rates, which has been in the press, but we're going to go a little deeper into the idea behind it and the use of funds. We'll go into RTD's system optimization plan, which just rolled out and is now open for public feedback. And we'll end with CDOT's greenhouse gas pollution reduction rulemaking, as well as what's next for that in terms of evaluating and prioritizing projects. So I'll turn it over to David Pulsipher. He's a manager in DOTI and is overseeing this effort. David, let me know if it gives you trouble sharing your screen.
Okay, let's take it away here. Share screen. Okay, we good?
It is there.
Awesome. All right, thanks guys. And I will put the link to this document in the chat for you. It's located on our DOTI's website in the document center. And thank you, Joel, for having me here. My name is David Pulsipher. I'm a planning supervisor with DOTI. My team oversees all of the bicycle and pedestrian planning in DOTI, and I was the project manager for the Complete Streets Design Guidelines. So as Joel said, we wrapped this effort in 2020. And, from the very onset, we knew that in order for this document and all the efforts to actually mean something, that we were going to have standards to regulate against this. And so it's always been part of the process. We've had set aside since 2018 for update to our standards as well as the guidelines. But the order in which we wanted to proceed was to have a comprehensive vision, and that really connected some of the ideas laid out in the Vision Zero Action Plan and Blueprint Denver, and translate that into some visionary, highly visual guidelines. Another really important part about this effort, it was very collaborative throughout the city, through the different departments like parks and community planning and development, our partners in RTD, CDOT, as well as we had representatives from the freight community, development community, fire department. So it was really important that we started from scratch with all these people and brought them along with us so that they could sort of see how we landed on certain decisions. And really pleased to report that our relationship with the fire and RTD and CDOT on relating to these measures has vastly improved from the time I joined the city. And so that's been a real major part of this. So we wrapped this document in 2020, and now we are preparing to update our standards and details, which were adopted most recently in 2017. So where we stand with that is we have money set aside and are about to start an on-call process, which we will solicit bids and proposals from a pre-selected set of consultant teams with relevant expertise. It's anticipated that contracting process will start quarter one of this year, and we're hoping actually to wrap up this effort of our update of our standards by the end of the year. And so that does leave with a delta of a year. So we have a plan for that. So what we're doing is, if you know, back in the olden days, DOTI actually, or back then it was Denver Public Works, did have a complete streets policy, but it was worded with very high language that made it difficult to interpret or enforce. And so what we're actually doing, an interim measure between the completion of our design guidelines and the completion of our design standards, is providing an updated policy that's signed by Adam Phipps, our interim executive director. And this executive policy will state the history of this document. And then it will also say, and we require our development community to refer to these guidelines and standards and use them for decision-making purposes up until the standards are being met. The reason we have to do that is, we've worked very closely with our partners who have to enforce development regulation, is that they need something behind them to say, hey, look, we design guidelines aren't just good enough to say, hey, we have these design guidelines. Well, then our partners will say, well, that's just a guideline. I need something in print. So we'll now be able to say, look, we have this policy. You have to refer to this document and adhere to it until our standards are in place. So that actually is in the process of getting signed this month. Hopefully that'll happen soon, and I'll be able to report back to you guys and share when that is official. And I'm sure it'll be a public facing document as well that you guys can refer to. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in that. So that's the quick elevator pitch on where we've come, where we're going, and where we are now. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And I'm going to send you guys the link to this document. And I guess there's some questions here I could go through. Or
yeah. Let me start with a framing question, if I may. From the time that the Complete Streets Design Guidelines were completed till now, can you give us just a summary of the work so far?
The summary of the work between when the design guidelines have been completed and now?
Yes.
Yeah, so I would say that's what's the major work there has been developing a policy that allows DOTI to actually use these guidelines in development, because right now they'll just say, oh, well, it's a nice guideline, but I don't have to do anything. So the policy will require them to do that. And that's kind of taken some time, working with the city attorney's office and, city charter and, making sure we have the wording right, our policy and development group. So that's kind of been the bulk of the work there, and really being sharp with our language.
Okay. And then in this interim phase, that's after this policy is signed, but until the new standards are made, it sounded like the new policy will direct private parties to follow the guidelines. Does it also direct city engineers and how streets are
Correct.
Designed by the city?
That's correct.
Okay. And there's sufficient guidance in this document that city engineers can use this in their work between now and when the standards are complete.
Yeah, there is. There's we get down to the inch on the parameters and things of desired and what we'd like to see. So there's definitely enough guidance there for sure.
Great, thanks so much. Amy, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I'm wondering if there's any guidelines in the Complete Streets guidelines that conflict with the MUCTD, I think I'm saying that right, standards.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say no. The MUTCD is very broad level and we down to like a finer level. But in general, MUTC standards are very broad and give cities sometimes too much flexibility. And so this, nails down and really aligns with what Denver's mobility, safety, quality of life goals are.
Thanks. David Mintzer.
Oh, thanks. My question was in the chat. I was just wondering if the change to 20 miles per hour speed limit will allow some of the guidelines to be improved or made more aggressive in regards to turning radii or any other interventions that slow down speeds.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely all part of the same conversation, David, definitely related. And, I would say, one of the big changes that the design guidelines is doing is that it's showing a shift in how we design streets. Typically something that's referenced a lot in the roadway engineering planning world is the idea of the 85th percentile, meaning you have to design a street or should design a street based on, what percent, 85% of the speed the cars are going. And, what we're saying is that, philosophically, we want to change to designs. So we are going to design to the speed that we want to see on the street. And that's the approach that Denver should take.
Would these guidelines potentially be updated to reflect that 20 mile an hour, or are they flexible enough to accommodate it?
Yeah, yeah, they're flexible enough to accommodate it. In most instances, especially as it relates to local roadways, it's only a change of 25, or it's only a change of 5 miles an hour. So these guidelines work with that.
Thank you. John Ricky.
Hey, I was just wondering, to which streets do these guidelines apply? All of them? Some of them?
Yeah, good question. So I would say where it's most relevant is where the city would be building a new street, because just because we have these guidelines doesn't mean there's a magic wand that all of a sudden make all of the streets in Denver fit these parameters. That'd be trillions of dollars. So it's most relevant towards new development, new streets, but it's also relevant for larger developments where they're doing a large percentage of a block face, and that impacts the street and the curb line. So it definitely allows us to make a piecemeal approach to the city, and especially on larger developments. But it's most relevant towards new roads and new development.
So it couldn't be applied, for existence, like you've done with the bike lanes during regular repaving?
Yeah, no, it wouldn't. Repaving wouldn't be a trigger alone to, dramatically, but definitely there's elements of it that can be used. So it's not like a black and white there. That's typically the catalyst for any street improvement is repaving. But if it's like radically, it's not have that big of an impact.
Glad you're thinking of it as radical change.
David, maybe you can go into a little more detail, because we do. So we just City Council just passed the 20 is plenty minor change to the municipal code that says where not otherwise posted on local streets, the implied speed limit is 20 miles per hour. We all know that doesn't immediately change people's behavior. People respond to how the street is designed. What things either helped by that change to 20 miles an hour and or helped by the design guidelines is DOTI now able to do at the time of routine street paving to encourage the use of the street at the desired speed?
Yeah. So I would say, the big things that come from, this culture changing, that's being, manifest through city council, and also, the community's voice, and then, reflected in these documents, is that we are doing speed treatments and traffic calming elements that the city has never done before, also including what the technical term vertical speed deflection or speed bumps, and like choke points and pinch points and chicanes and all sorts of things that the city has never done before. Now, documents like this opened the toolbox to allow us to really take physical measures to slow people's speed down. Yeah, that complements the regulatory side of a mile per hour change.
So even in a simple case of repaving, introducing some of those elements when the restriping is done could be done, and the engineers wouldn't have to be saying, is this consistent with a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit? They could say, is this intervention consistent with a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit? Since that's now our goal.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, great. Richard Crane, you had a question. And you have to unmute.
Yeah, the question I had was about the plethora of one-way streets. Will this be addressing that, converting those as two-way streets, which is inherently better for pedestrians, bicyclists, and retail?
Yeah, that's a good question. This document doesn't necessarily recommend a one-way street over a two-way street. It would be more like, once the decision has been made to make a one-way, then the design guidelines would come into play. But it's not, it doesn't, undo the existing street grid, if that makes sense.
Right. Hmm.
Okay, and it has been, the city's slow but persistent move to convert one-ways to two-ways. I've seen some of that going on. This is consistent with that, but this isn't necessarily directing that, is what I'm hearing.
That's correct. Yeah, this isn't, well, sometimes we say this isn't necessarily like a prescriptive document in that it all of a sudden, applies to all the existing streets, and, you have to start making all these. It's more of when you get to that street and development is happening or a repaving project is happening, then we look at it, what can we accomplish?
Okay, David Metzer has a question about iterative change.
Well, I was just giving an example. Like, for a couple of years ago, they did the curb and gutter on 13th and 14th Avenues through Congress Park, and we all know that's such a hard street to cross. But when they did the curb, they didn't add bulb outs at any intersections, and that was, I thought, a missed opportunity during routine maintenance. So would these guidelines kind of encourage that kind of change during routine upgrades?
Yeah, the installation of bulb outs is a pretty pricey installation. So a normal repaving, probably not. I mean, definitely updating the curb ramps to make them ADA compatible, yes. But typically we look at like doing bulb outs when we're actually doing some larger intersection, updating the intersection infrastructure. That's typically when we would look at like hard concrete bulb out scenario, or as like another existing part of like a Safe Routes to School project or an NTMP project, but not necessarily just paving. It'd have to be kind of a harmony of a couple projects. Because of its
well, the ADA ramps at intersections are kind of a standard design everywhere when they're upgraded. Would that design be upgraded to include a bulb out to make the crossing easier?
It's really a case by case basis, really. That's not like a absolutely for every intersection.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought from a kind of one build perspective. If you're there repaving, then of course you're going to be restriping. And so what can you do with stripes with paint that further the vision? If you're there, on the other hand, doing curb and gutter, you're already pouring concrete and doing forms. What else could you do while you're there with concrete? So I appreciate that perspective. Thank you. Andy has a question about bigger changes and new development. Andy?
Yeah, again, I think kind of like David's, I guess I'm confirming, like I think of, like the federal Colfax Cloverleaf, when they talk about a potential future where there would be new streets extended out from the existing grid and new development there, that's where you see this complete street policy become the default, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, that's a conversation we've had, right now in terms of things happening with Loretto Heights, Yeah, the development in the Northeast Denver, River Mile, and the mentioned comments, absolutely.
Thank you.
David, you mentioned River Mile. The developers there a couple of years ago, when they were going through a planning process, were showing really compelling visions of their public spaces and streets. And one of the comments they made was they might have to keep the streets as private streets because they wanted to do them to this aspirational, multimodal, comfortable standard that the existing Denver standards just wouldn't let them do. So they couldn't convey the streets to Denver because Denver would say, well, you haven't done it right. Have these guidelines come far enough in your and your colleagues' discussions with the River Mile folks that their vision is compatible with what this calls for?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so, because that, those comments obviously predated this document.
Great. Antonio, who's co-chair of the new DOTI board, has a question. Antonio, are you there? There you are.
Yeah, I am. Hey, David, question I had for you. I often hear from traffic engineers when we're doing infill development, and they would be required to update the standards, the street type in front of their, let's say, new building. And the excuse that I often hear is that because the streets around them are not complete streets, what takes precedence? Would there be just kind of this, one strip of complete streets and then, continuation of a non-complete street? Or would they, in this case, not build a complete street because it doesn't exist around that site, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. We definitely don't let them off the hook that easy. There's lots of times when people, we have them building sidewalk, even though their neighbors aren't building sidewalks. It's got to start somewhere. And if you don't require them to do it now, then there'll be a gap later on. So, that's, of course, there's variances and compromises that are made on a project by project basis. But overall, the lack of connectivity isn't something you can ultimately hang your hat on, say, as a reason not to do these.
Gotcha. Thank you. And did I hear you correctly saying that Director Phipps is going to sign this probably here soon, and the new development?
That's correct.
The next developments after that would be required to do that, and then once this is updated in the standards at the end of the year, then that kind of be the final.
That's correct.
Wrap on that. Am I understanding that correctly? Perfect.
That's correct.
That's all.
We're having a bit of Zoom stuttering, so it wouldn't be 2022 if it weren't like 2021. John Ricky wants to know, David, what is your favorite recommendation in the Complete Streets Design Guidelines?
Oh, that's a good one, John. So I would say my favorite definitely is the speed humps or vertical speed deflection. Emphasized by a quick anecdote. When I first got to the city of Denver, one of my first field visits was out at a school, and they're like, yeah, we're dealing with this speeding problem and we don't know what to do about it. I was like, oh, this is super easy. Let's just do speed humps. Let's move to the next place. And the city engineer at the time, or traffic engineer, was like, oh, we don't do those. I was like, what? Why not? And he's like, we're never going to do those. And I said, before I leave, we will. And so he's gone and we're doing speed humps. So I won that battle. And so that's just really exciting. We're piloting them now, and they'll be going in likely this summer. And we're just taking a really measured approach before we deploy them at a larger scale. But that's something I'm really, really excited about because they're a very practical tool, overwhelmingly supported by the public and most people, really effective. So that's what I'm excited about, John.
Great. And let's end with coming back to Amy. She had a couple questions that really dial in on the city engineers. Amy, do you want to pose those?
I'm just wondering, how are you going to roll this out to the DOTI engineers internally? Is there going to be, I don't know, special training or an emphasis from the inside of DOTI?
Yeah, that's a Great question, Amy. So yeah, that's something that I'm working on, is like an internal training module. I'll be doing like a series of briefings with like the big wigs, and then kind of telling them and about all this. And then ultimately we have a ton of annual trainings that we have to do through our HR software. And the vision is that every year our engineers will have to do like a complete streets design standards training. It's just kind of like a refresher on all the things you have to do. I do it every year for like ADA compliance and curb ramp slopes and things like that. So this will just be added to that process.
Good. I think that's really important. Thank you.
And while I can imagine with kind of a stereotype of engineers in my head, some frustration that these aren't, the engineering level specifications that they're accustomed to seeing, that could be played to a really good feedback loop to make sure that the standards that are being developed this year for completion at the end of the year have all those things. So by the end of the year, they've been using the guidelines and they've been being sure that the standards under development give them the details they will use day to day. This is such great news, David. Thank you for joining us. You're welcome to stay and answer questions in the chat that we didn't get to. Please, if you want closing comments.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, and the key to that is that we're not at odds with our engineers. We brought them along through this process, so this isn't something that's being done to them. It was done with them, and that's a really big procedural distinction. Is that we built this together, so there's a lot of buy-in from them already.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I'm sure they'll be with you every step of the way in developing the standards. We'll now turn to, and there's a lot of claps in the chat. I want to get that, mention that for the recording. We're going to turn now to Alyssa Alt. Alyssa Alt is a manager in DOTI of Curblane topics, and she's going to tell us about the changes to the parking meters, but where that fits in the overall framing of what we're trying to do with managing the Curblane, and then any funds that are raised, what they'll be used for. Welcome, Alyssa. It's been a little while.
It has been a little while. Thanks for having me. Can you guys hear me? Everything good?
We can. Your screen is up. It's not in presentation mode, but we can see it just fine.
Yeah, I'm more of a Teams person, so Zoom, sometimes I try to just do the bare minimum. So thank you for having me. My name again is Alyssa Alt. I manage our curbside and parking team here in DOTI. And so right now what I'm here to talk about really is our meter rate adjustment that just went into effect January 3rd. So the presentation that I'm going to give today was something that we have given in the past to sort of explain why this is important and where we're coming from. So some of the words may say should do and have, but a lot of it has already been done. And so I just want to give that that context. So what we're going to do is really talk about the importance of pricing and of the curb, the situation where we have been in the past, where we're trying to go, and a little bit of like a roadmap of where we're headed in the future. So so why is parking pricing important? I think we all really know this. So this is I'm speaking to the choir here, but on-street parking for years and years and years has been too low. $1 an hour throughout the entire city. It's just something that can cause a lot of issues and concerns. So basically, if parking is easy to find, people are moving around and changing, or they're trying to use this on-street parking for longer term parking, which is not what it's meant for. It's really meant for short term. There can be conflicts with bike lanes. There can be conflicts with transit. There can be conflicts with deliveries. And so really what we're trying to do is also make sure that the curb is really being utilized for the highest and best use, and that we are pricing it appropriately so that things, so that you can really see the value. It's a very highly utilized, highly needed, highly functioning part of our transportation system. And so it really needs to be priced like that. So, we also have a lot of big goals, which you guys are all very much aware of, I'm sure. Mobility action plan and other things that really, that Denver is trying to get to. And by pricing our parking, on-street parking so low, we're not really pushing ourselves towards those goals. So this is just something from a while ago, as you guys have all seen in the past. So how is it working today? Or, I'm going to say in December of 2021. We have about 6,200 parking spaces in Denver. The blue space is downtown, which we used to have overnight parking so you pay for parking basically all night long, 24 hours a day. We currently are not pricing parking overnight. During the pandemic, we changed that. So now pricing in downtown is 8 to 10. I don't see that changing anymore anytime soon, but really we have quite a few parking spaces all over the city. Time limits are our primary tool of how we manage parking in general, but the next way we do that is through pricing. So that's where we have them today. And then this is just a little history. So in 2002, the meter prices were raised to $1.50. There was a lot of public outrage, I guess. Mayor Hickenlooper then brought them back down to $1 an hour max. They hovered, between 50 cents and a dollar for many, many years. In 2010, we got new state-of-the-art smart meters. They've been on the street for the last 12 years. And now we are really looking at the impact that has had. Inflation, on-street parking has not stayed in line with off-street parking. Off-street parking is significantly more expensive, which in reality, it should be the flip, where you pay less to park off-street, where there's more time and you can be there for longer. And you pay more for the premium of the space that's on the street and for the need. So here we are now. We were lucky enough to get the parking pricing update in the 2022 budget. And so in January 3rd, we were able to increase it. Again, Denver also, just to bring this point home, Denver has been low on compared to our peer cities for many, many years. Most of our peer cities also have some sort of performance-based, demand-based pricing. So depending on the time of day, depending on the time of week, that the prices would be higher or lower because of demand. In Denver, really, we've just been using our time limits and using just very small, very low amounts of, or very cheap parking on street for many, many years. So where are we going? What we're trying to do is really reflect, what the value of the curb space, like I've mentioned, really think about what the curbside is for. David in the Complete Streets is a great segue into this conversation. Really, like the best to highest and best use for curb is really not parking. It's bike lanes, it's transit lanes, it's increased pedestrians, it's bulb outs, it's deliveries, it's things like that people need. Of course, we're really trying to encourage short-term parking on street, increase turnover, as much as we all probably believe in the way that parking is not the only way to get around town. And we've put a lot of effort and a lot of resources into transit lanes and bike lanes, and the other businesses are still, thinking about the number of people who can come in the street and how often the curb in front of them is turned over with cars. So we really want to encourage that short-term parking. And as everyone knows, delivery has just skyrocketed, particularly during the pandemic, but it has been like that for years. So before, maybe it was delivering of people with TNCs, Ubers and Lyfts, and now it's delivering of things, small things, big things, all types of things, cars. I mean, you can do just about anything to your home or to your business. So really trying to think about the curb and maximize it. And as we take away space on street, we really want to make sure that we're using that space appropriately. So we're doing a lot of things. We've had a strategic parking plan in 2010, which it's called a strategic parking plan. So that things have changed. We used to be parking operations, and we are now curbside and curbside management. So we are moving and shaking, and we'll be doing an update to that plan this year. In addition to the Denver Moves Everyone that'll be an action plan and really focused on the curbside. We work in neighborhoods often to look at things comprehensively, and we're really trying to think about car sharing and how can we improve car share. So we have Free to Move that just launched recently. I'm not sure if you've seen that. It's a free floating type of car sharing. And then we also have our Zip Car and our Colorado Car Share that have been long-term partners. There's been a pretty big influx of folks using Turo and Get Around, which is sort of the peer-to-peer car sharing. City-sponsored bike parking, our team does that. And we're really trying to pull in all the different types of planning and all the good work that the planning team and DOTI and the planning team and NCPD have been doing, so that we can, really just move together. So where we're going. So really, this is where we're at right now. Phase 1, parking pricing proposal. We did that. We're asking $2 an hour. It's awesome. We got it. And right now we are actually also enhancing our parking system. Our meters are old. We have an amazing team of people who manage them every day, and they have reached their end of their life. And so we have been replacing them currently. So we're doing that right now. Those should all be fully installed by the end, well, hopefully by the end of Q2 of 2022, but most likely much more before that. So that's exciting. Phase 2, demand responsive pricing. So thinking about the way that we are actually managing it. So $2 an hour is a great first step, but now we really want to look at like the demand. So if we are thinking about, say, around Union Station, and we think that the nightlife is going to come back much more in 2022, so people are going to be busy and being out there, and it makes more sense to have that cost more. Or if you're going to be there for 3 hours, maybe you price the first 2 hours one price, and then increase pricing. That's all something that we are working on this year to try to really like think about the demand and like respond to the demand versus just having a flat price. We're also doing a bunch of curbside pilots, which I will mention here. I have another slide for that in the future here. And then the third phase, which is another thing that is actually coming up quite soon, is actually adjusting the citation fines and parking fines. So the fines have not been increased for many, many years. I think 2007 was the last time that there was a comprehensive increase. So that is going to be coming actually in February, where we'll be increasing some of the fines that goes through the court system. So presiding judge is the one who actually makes the final decisions on that. But the prices will be going up roughly $10 per citation. So if you have a $25 ticket, you'll probably be getting a $35 ticket. They're not all just standard like that, but really what the whole idea of this is about safety. So like really making sure that people understand that if you're parking in a bike lane, that's actually one that will be going up quite a bit higher from $25 to $65. So if you're parking in a bike lane, like that's a big deal. We're trying to get you to get out of that bike lane. Like it's a real disincentive, and it's really not about money, even though there is money involved in it, but it is truly about compliance and safety and making sure that people are going to be are using the curbside the way we're intending it. So that there's more to come with that here in the next few weeks, but just a little teaser for you. So revenue, speaking directly just to the meter rate increase, we're expecting about $9.5 million. We make around $11 million a year in meters. It has fluctuated a little bit throughout the pandemic. So this is where this is 40% to transit, 20% to bikes, 20% to pedestrians, and 20% to Vision Zero. I don't have any specifics about what those projects are going to be. I'm sure there'll be questions about that, but this is where we're at. I know there's a lot of work being done to allocate that money. At 9.5 million, split up between these different things. It ends up being not that much in a year, but it's a pretty great way to have a dedicated revenue from things that, through a program that we already are doing and through a way that we are really trying to help, change behavior. So really want to help solidify that. So what's next? So also in spring of 2021, we launched Pay by Phone, which is a mobile payment for the meters. So if you guys haven't done that or downloaded that, and if you do drive around and ever park at any of our meters, it's really great. It's easy. Once you have your stuff in there, you have an account, you can just do it. You can, extend your meter up to the time limit. It's just really easy. January 2022, here we are, adjusted meter rates from $1 to $2. And then into the future, again, we're going to update our meter equipment, and we're going to look at performance-based pricing, and we'll expand some Curblane pilots. So here's our new technology. Here's one of our guys, Trinidad, out there doing his work. He's a great team, and here's some of our new technology. So most of the time you won't even notice that our meters are different. They'll just work. Your credit card won't get stuck. You'll be able to use NFC, which is like Apple Pay and Google Pay at the meters. They're not quite ready yet, but that will happen soon. So they'll just be working much better. So about a fourth of our single space meters will be replaced with multi-space. So this is our new meter that will be starting in Cherry Creek, and then some of our more outlying areas that we have. So we've been expanding, and then we'll also be expanding paid parking which we have not done in many years either. And it's time for some areas to move to the next level. So expect seeing some of that in the future. And then we have some really great, exciting pilots. At least I think they're exciting from a nerdy curbside management way. We're working on this parking occupancy model. So we're going to be able to take a lot of our paid parking information, and we're working with this really great company out of Seattle, and they're going to put in that information, and they'll do the analysis for us and hopefully do some machine learning so that it becomes smarter and smarter. And so we can really actually have a better understanding of how we can create a demand-based pricing model. So when the meters are being utilized, when they're being paid, and like feed in that information plus citation data, just a bunch of information into a place, we'll analyze it for us, because while the city does a lot of amazing things, maybe data analysis is not necessarily our strong suit. There's just not enough people to do it. So I'm really excited about that. I think it will really be helpful for the program moving forward. And then our smart zone pilot. So I'm not sure if some of you have maybe seen Cord, which is a company that basically you use an app and we have zones throughout. We're going to start this in the Rhino Upper Larimer area. And so you basically have zones that are smart zones. You use your phone. The delivery drivers will use your phone to say, oh, this space is open. I'm going to go to there. There'll be a cost to it. But it's mostly more or less letting you know that the space is open. So we're going to try that in Rhino and see how it works. And if it works well, we're going to move it to bigger into Denver. And then also we're working with another company that's helping us digitize our curb. So while we know where a lot of our signs are, we don't know where all of our signs are. And if we can figure out where they all are and understand where the curb, a lot of this has to do with more of the 2-hour parking, like 3-hour parking, that kind of thing that we have throughout the city. So as we know that, we can at least put that into some sort of wayfinding application or other mapping systems, so that people can understand what they are going to be seeing when they get there, so that they know there's a restriction, if they need to have a permit, that kind of thing. So that's exciting stuff for us. And that's about it.
Well, thank you very much. You know, the newspapers get the parking rates are going up, and then hot takes as what people think, but we get the real insight into what you're up to, and you're up to a lot. Let me turn to just a few questions here. Lauren was asking about enforcement. Lauren?
My apologies. Yeah, I was just going to ask, given kind of a lot of the staffing shortages that I imagine you and several other departments face, and with the possible increased amount of meters, how are you trying to hire and retain people to be kind of the enforcement and the muscle arm of, getting people to comply with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, so my team actually does not oversee the right-of-way enforcement team. We're on a separate groups, sort of on purpose, where we're like the policy and then they enforce the policy. But I'll say one thing about expanding paid parking is that we have a lot of vehicles in the city for our enforcement team that use license plate recognition to do the enforcement. So honestly, the more that we have paid parking, it's just a little bit easier for them to actually do the enforcement instead of having to time mark, come back around. It's kind of like you've paid or you're not paid. They can also check through like our pay by phone. So the more folks that are using pay by phone, they have more information about whether or not the car's been there for 2 hours, 3 hours. Like there's just more information that they have. It actually requires less people. That's not saying that we're not trying to hire and actively find folks. We are, for sure. It's just, as everyone knows, it's extremely difficult to keep people and to, so I don't have a great answer for that. I can get back to you with a little bit more information from our enforcement team if you want, but unfortunately.
Absolutely, that'd be appreciated. Thank you. Sure.
Continuing from enforcement, because the technology does a lot of stuff, but at the moment, there's no technology that says this is occupied by someone who hasn't paid, or this person's paid too long. Perry Burnup has a question about money raised. Perry?
Hey, Alyssa.
Hi, Perry.
I have a question. You mentioned that the increases, the fines will be increased for the first time since 2007. Does the 9.5 million include that increased revenue?
It doesn't include it. The number, I don't think that they're quite there yet with the number that the citation rate is, or the citation rate will generate. I think it'll probably be close to that. Like, so it would be like a doubling of it. But I don't want to, like, I don't know that for sure. I don't know what they're saying exactly. Like, we've been kind of.
Do you have a sense that it will be spent on the same buckets?
That's my expectation, and that's what I've just have heard. So I think everyone's just trying to work through that. But I do expect that to be the case.
Okay, thanks.
To finalize it.
Now, with receiving this money and putting it to all these good purposes, Rob has a question about what this does to our philosophy.
Yeah, I was just curious, because you are receiving revenue, does that make it harder to remove parking in the future for better uses like bike lanes or more pedestrian space?
I think that's a great question. I don't actually think it does. I do think that while we are creating revenue, a lot of the places that where the parking meters are right now, I mean, let me go back. Like, we're still talking about highest and best use of the space. And so if the highest and best use of the space is moving people through with a bus lane and transit lane or with a bike lane, like, that is just the highest and best use. I think that the way that the city is growing, that there will be expansion. Parking is not going to go away fully. So there will be expansion of paid parking to other areas of the city that as things grow and change and densify. So I don't necessarily think it's going to be a huge moneymaker for this program, but I don't see it being something that would actually, honestly, the paid parking is the least, it's the part that is almost the easiest to remove for these projects, more than it is like in front of residents, in my experience. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jill wanted to ask, with regard to increasing fines, and of course, you need to motivate the behavior we're trying to see. What were the equity considerations, or what analysis was done for any equity concerns on higher fines?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, so since the presiding judge is the one who sort of makes that determination, we gave a lot of input as DOTI. We gave input because we thought that, you know, we do want compliance. But I don't know if I don't exactly know is my answer. I think that one of the fines that's going up is ADA parking spaces from $150 to $350, because we've seen a huge increase in misuse of those spaces. And so that was one that was like really important for people to make sure that those spaces are open for folks who really need it, who have a valid placard. In regards to the rest of the I'm not 100% sure. I don't know.
It's a tricky area. Yeah.
We also do have payment plans for most things. So I know, and which does not mean that we're meeting the equity, but yeah, it's a tough one.
Okay. Let's move from just the monetary aspect to use of the curb lane. Mark has a question about use of the curb lane and car sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as somebody who, when Car2Go pulled out of the city, what was that, just 2.5 years ago or so? Yeah. Within a few months, we as a family were faced with a situation where we had to go buy a second car. Yeah. And, we were able to get away with using Car2Go before that. So what are you guys doing? You mentioned, attempting to get more car sharing. Mm-hmm. What are you guys doing to incent that to happen? Is DOTI considering running/contracting for a car sharing program similar to what you are now doing with bike sharing?
Yeah, we are not considering that. So we are also going through we're not really considering owning or operating our own or contracting with one specifically. The way that our car share program has been a free market. I think that you will see, so full disclosure, I used to work for Colorado Car Share before I worked for the city. I worked for them for 5 years. Car share is like, I believe in it. I think it is important. I think it is a major way to people to not own vehicles like your family. So the thing that we're working on right now is our car share rules and regs that are pretty old, about 7 years old. And so we're working on ways to incentivize folks, more or less to incentivize companies to go electric. So trying to get folks like some of the car share companies to invest in electric, which would then reduce their costs for a permit cost, to really think about equity. So making sure that they're in specific neighborhoods, and if they're in neighborhoods or if they're providing different types of incentives to folks to use car share, then possibly reducing their costs from a permit perspective. We only have so much that we can manage from permitting. I think car share all over the country has sort of gone up and down, started with nonprofits and local companies, got bought out by some of the big ones, sort of like Car2Go, came back down and is now sort of, Colorado Car Share, which has been around for, I don't know, 20 years or something, keeps trying to be here and fill that need. So we're working on ways to incentivize folks to come here and different companies to come here, but there just aren't actually that many car shares at this point. The thing that I think is actually super exciting is the Turos and the get-arounds. I think that there is a little bit of problematicness to them, but I also think that that's sort of, using something like the whole idea of car share to begin with was, I have an extra car, let's share with my neighbors. If that could truly happen in a real measured manner, I think that could be a really big boon for the city and for folks.
Privately owned cars are sitting still the vast majority of the time.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's an opportunity there. With regard to car share companies, so not the peer-to-peer, but the new companies taking the place of Car2Go, et cetera. Lucia, I want to know, you mentioned new ones. Which ones are they?
The new one is just free to move. They've recently launched. They have mostly Jeeps, I think. They have about 150 cars. It's a free floating model similar to Car2Go. So they started with 50 in October. Like everything else too, they had a supply chain issue, so they're having trouble getting vehicles, but I think that they're kind of getting over that. They are in Portland and in DC right now as well. And I think they may be going to a couple other cities in the country. But they're I think that they're from Paris or from France is where they started. And so that's why now they're here. Great.
We've got a lot of love in the chat for demand responsive pricing and the future direction. So I just want to make note of that. Jill also had a question about how is the city coordinating with off-street like parking garages and parking lots on, I mean, you can't rate set, but is there some way to, as you said, make the rates more rational? So when you're using the more limited on-street space, you're paying more than the off-street space, and that might lead to freeing up space for other curb space for other uses.
Yeah, it's a really hard one because we don't control it at all. Like in the city of Denver, we own like very little parking, off-street parking, so we don't even have a way to like help basically like level set from the off-street side. We do work with the Downtown Denver Partnership, and we also work with the Cherry Creek Bid on parking and that kind of stuff. And they have a better handle on actually like trying to work with their membership, but it is really hard. We do work with our off-street partners, but it's really hard. The rate, everybody, it's really hard. The rate part is very hard to manage. So yeah, that's fairly.
Okay, you just keep
finding asking
to bump up the on-street prices to come up to what the off-street is. Is the price setting for meters require action by city council, or is it administratively set?
It's administratively set. So the executive director of DOTI can actually make that. We've been working with council and with the mayor's office, obviously, just because. Yeah.
They need to know, but it also needs to not be political.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're trying to get to, where, that's the whole point of demand. Like you're paying for a premium space. And so the idea is really that we're not just going to every 20 years change the price. Like that this isn't a thing that will continue to happen. You'll continue to see it and things will go up and down depending on the demand. And that is 100% what we're trying to get to. So this is step one and step 2, 3. And, as we go down the road, that's the idea.
Let's end with another question from Perry that kind of broadens the discussion on environmental angle.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, a lot of love from me on this promising and overdue development for paying for safer, higher quality of life in our city, and also a cleaner one. And that's my question: is how will these promising transportation investments be prioritized, both what they are and where they happen? I'm on the Sustainable Advisory Committee's Transportation Committee. And I'm curious about whether routinely potential greenhouse gas emissions reductions will be calculated for candidate projects and used as a selection criteria.
That's a really good question, Perry, and I do not have the answer to that.
Okay.
I'm more on the operation side, so I can absolutely talk to our folks and get back to you on that.
Yeah, get the conversation started if it's
100%.
not happening
Yeah,
yet.
for sure.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. This is good stuff going in a great direction. We'll have you back regularly to talk about how this is rolling out and how we're transforming. We had questions that you answered in the course of talking. People were asking, will meters be used in more places in the city? And you answered that before I got to ask it. And now the chat is filling up with thank you and great stuff. So I hope you're looking at that.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Our third topic for the evening is RTD, and the Reimagine RTD project has reached a milestone coming out with the system optimization plan. And so I'd like to invite up, if Alyssa, I hope you stop sharing, that's great. I'd like to invite up Julie Skeen and Doug Monroe. Julie Skeen is with the Reimagine RTD project team, and Doug Monroe is a manager of corridor planning, I believe, with RTD. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It is not allowing me to share my screen.
Okay, it should, because you're the co-host. Try again. It could have just been that Alyssa was up.
All right, let's see. No, I'm getting an error message. Let's try. I am sorry, Joel. Can you pull it up from your end?
I can, yes.
Sorry about that.
That's
Good thing Joel was planning ahead. He knew this might happen. So he has our presentation for us. Thank you so much. As Joel mentioned, thank you very much. I'm Julie Skeen. I'm with the Reimagine project team. And I've also got Doug Monroe here from RTD. He's going to actually help me present this. We're very excited to talk to you a little bit about the Reimagine RTD process. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about our agenda. We're going to talk overall about what Reimagine RTD is. This is a study we started in around the 2019 timeframe. We're really going to focus on the systems optimization plan, because as Joel said, this is a really important key. It is essentially a route by route guide for how RTD will be a growing service from levels now up until about 2027. So we'll talk about that. Then I'll give you a little bit on the mobility plan for the future. And then we'll talk about public engagement. So very interested in your questions. Love your thoughts on this. So I'll start us off. Hopefully you've heard of Reimagine RTD, but if you have not, this is a project we started in 2019, and it has two major components. So the one is redesigning the services to really to balance the needs, make the system more efficient, and essentially work within RTD's fiscal constraints. So it's a short-term route-by-route analysis to determine the best and most efficient way to provide service throughout the region. So that's going to be the primary topic of our discussion today. And then the second piece is the mobility plan for the future. That's the long-term piece. So that's the 2030 plan. So what we're taking a look at, as you know, there's been a lot of changes in the transportation. I'm sure you guys are just talking about them. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of new partners. There's a lot of different players, and there's going to be a lot of changing needs as we look into the long term. So mobility plan for the future, sort of looking at the long-term systems optimization plan. How do we do the most in the most efficient manner with the finances that RTD has for right now? So with that, I'm going to have Doug Monroe. He is our expert with RTD on the systems optimization plan, and he's going to take us through these next couple of slides.
Julie. So I guess the first question is, why do a system optimization plan? RTD hasn't taken a comprehensive look at the entire system since switching to what we call the grid system in 1978. Prior to that, RTD operated pretty much a route network that was entirely focused on downtown Denver. In 1978, switched to a grid system where transfers take place at major cross streets. So, as fast tracks rail lines have opened, we've taken a look at the bus services that complement those rail lines. Over the last several years, of course, we do 3 service changes per year. where we take a look at routes as well. But it's been a long time since we actually looked at the entire system at once and how everything works together and interacts with each other. So that kind of got things started on the system optimization plan. And more recently, looking at how a system optimization plan can benefit RTD, trying to reverse and mitigate trends of ridership loss that have been common in the transit industry across the country for the last 8 or 10 years or so, and then of course really exacerbated by COVID in the last couple of years as well. Improving service performance and efficiency, ensuring our fiscal sustainability. That was a theme prior to COVID as well, trying to right size the system for the resources that we had available, and just addressing changing travel to market demands to remain competitive across the travel market. So the steps at the bottom of this slide kind of give a walkthrough of the steps that we've taken so far in the SOP. About a year or so ago, we finished the comprehensive assessment of services that analyzed all of the routes within RTD and looked at what was going well and what wasn't working with those. Reviewing existing travel patterns, we used location-based services data, which is cell phone data, we'll call it, where it's anonymous data that's collected from cell phone users and can get a good idea of where they live and where they work or go to school. To establish those kinds of travel patterns also helps us establish travel patterns for certain equity groups, because we can identify where what people live in zones that are known to be low income or minority, and see where they're actually traveling to and from. And then as I mentioned, the financial capacity of RTD has been a real challenge, and especially with COVID over the last year, last couple of years. But as we've gotten federal grants and things like that, taking that into account as to what the SOP can offer over the next 5 years, basically, and then discussing community and agency goals and values as far as what we should focus on. We're a regional agency covering about 2,400 square miles. Denver is a relatively small part of the overall picture there, but certainly an important part, and where we generate a considerable portion of our ridership. So that's all led us to what we have in the draft system optimization plan now, which is available for comment. So if we go to the next slide. Just some considerations as we're rebuilding service as part of the SOP here, and valuing employees' health, safety, and well-being. This is really an important one, especially with our new general manager too. Prior to the pandemic, we had a real workforce issue in terms of being able to recruit and retain enough bus operators. And a lot of that had to do with the tough conditions of the job. And our new general manager has kind of taken a different approach to that, and isn't forcing overtime on employees, on the frontline employees to be able to provide service, which definitely helps with the retention. But it doesn't necessarily allow us to cover as much work as we did previously, because we have to rely on volunteers to actually cover it instead of being able to mandate that an employee operate that. So aligning the level of service with the actual number of employees that we have is a big consideration as we start to increase service. Equity was a big one. It was a big priority for the board and for our stakeholders. As COVID has been around for the last couple of years, we've especially noticed that people that live in our equity zones that live in, I shouldn't say equity zones, but live in areas with those high equity populations, have continued to ride the RTD system at a much higher rate than passengers who don't fit into those categories. So that's been an important theme as we've looked at how service is going to be restored. And then the financial picture as well. We do have those one-time federal revenues from several of the aid packages that were passed that we're hoping to use to continue as we continue restoring service up through 2027. So we do also have a substantial asset management backlog that a lot of that is being balanced against each other as service is restored. Next slide. And then there's, a lot of unknowns still. The impact of telework is something to be, the overall impact is still to be seen. I mean, people really aren't going back into the office even on a medium scale basis or anything at this point. And once the pandemic is over or whatever you will there, I think the expectations are that telework is going to be a much bigger part of the commute pattern, if you want to call it that, going forward. So, being able to take that into account as to how, or to the levels of service and to where we offer service in the future. And then I think one thing that's been difficult to communicate as part of this is, not all routes will be restored. There's still several routes that were discontinued with the pandemic that weren't that haven't been brought back yet and have had poor ridership prior to the pandemic. And the expectations bringing those back are that things would be, or that they would still not, definitely not perform to the level that would be expected or needed to provide that service. So next slide. So in developing the system optimization plan, we looked at several things: the system structure and modifying RTD's family of services from categories that were really based on land use around those routes that kind of dictated whether things were a CBD local route that went downtown, an urban local route that was, in a pretty high density area, a suburban local route that was, in a more low density area, focusing more on travel markets that we'll get to in a couple of slides here that allow for a better structuring of how the routes are compared to each other in terms of performance. Support well-defined transit transfer hubs for connectivity, and I'll get a little bit more on this one in just a minute here as we talk about reliability. Retaining clock-faced headways. Clock-faced headways are basically route schedules that repeat each other, that repeat hour after hour. So if a route operates every 15 minutes, the bus comes at the same 15-minute intervals each hour. Or if it's every half hour, it comes at the same half-hour intervals each hour and repeats every hour. And that's good for customers because it allows them to it allows them to remember when their bus comes much more easily. At the same time, it allows for much easier scheduling in between routes and creating the connections in between routes, because if you've got two 15-minute routes that connect with each other, they're always going to have a similar transfer between them. Likewise, if you have a 15 and a 30-minute route that connect with each other, they line up better than, if one was at 20 minutes and it all of a sudden you've got, that route operates every 20 and then 40 minutes, and the other route continues to operate every 30 minutes, and the routes don't connect with each other all the time very well. So that's what we mean by clock-faced headways. And then defining consistent minimum spans of service. So that's, the time, basically the times of day that the route operates from early in the morning until late at night. Bus route design, focusing on simplification. This is a big convenience for customers to be able to understand where routes go and not having a lot of deviations within the routes, so that they have an easy understanding of where they go. Consistency, getting rid of irregular trip patterns. So those are things like short turns where a route doesn't complete the entire route each time. Another thing that is good for customers so they don't accidentally get on the wrong bus, and also contributes to the reliability of the buses as well, and having consistent service spans across the day. I mentioned reliability in terms of having well-defined transit transfer hubs and elimination of long routes. And this doesn't mean the elimination of service along corridors necessarily, but actually splitting up long routes so that instead of having a very long route that might take 2 hours from end to end, splitting it into 2 1-hour routes, so there's less opportunity for delay along the route. The route can function as 2 routes basically, and have the reliability that comes along with having a shorter route on both ends. And when we looked at doing this, we looked for locations where there already weren't many through passengers. So we're not going to be forcing a transfer on many passengers. So that generally happens at rail stations or connections to other buses where a lot of transfers to those services were happening already, and not many passengers were riding through on the service that is being split up. If you move on to the next slide. And we just wanted to give one example to this group today, just because this is such a big plan. But I did want to talk about the light rail patterns. And what we have on this first slide here is what our light rail network looked like in 2019. And I think the focus is on the southeast and southwest corridors. So that's the C, D, E, F, and H lines. I'm sorry, that's the southeast corridor, the CD, or I guess I should just say the southern part of the light rail network, the C, D, E, F, and H lines. So those lines operated in the peak, operated every 15 minutes. And we had real issues with reliability in the busiest part of the system in between I-25 and Broadway Station and 10th and Osage Station, where basically all 5 lines were trying to fit through one section of track. And it caused problems in just getting all the trains through there, because basically any delay would reverberate through the entire system because we were at the max capacity through there. And looking at how we offered service, we basically offer service from everywhere to everywhere, as we call it. So from Littleton Mineral on the C line to Union Station, and on the D line to 16th and California, and on the southeast corridor on the E line to Union Station, and on the F line to 18th to California Street, which is I guess not the optimal way to operate the system. In terms, it's nice to have the 1-seat rides for everybody, but it really causes issues with the operations of the system. And so if you go to the next slide, the proposal is to actually get rid of the C and F lines. So the D line would operate to the California Street corridor downtown, and the E line would operate to Union Station, and you would be able to transfer between those routes anywhere in between Broadway, I-25 and Broadway, and 10th and Osage Station, so that I mean the connections are still there. You do have to make a transfer to do it, but it will free up a lot of space in the busiest section of the track in between I-25 and Broadway Station and 10th and Osage, so that the whole system should operate much more smoothly. And the idea also is that we would then be able to increase frequency on the D, E, and H lines, so that instead of operating every 15 minutes, those lines could actually operate every 10 minutes to provide additional service there. And we can also run on longer trains to make up for, potential loss in capacity. So overall, there's not a loss of capacity through there. It's just structured a little differently, and you might have to make a transfer to be able to do it. And of course, we can keep services on the CNF line available for special event services, especially Broncos games, which we've done in the past season that just wrapped up here. So moving on to the next slide. The travel market service categories. So these are what we're gonna see when we look at the individual routes, and these are the 4 service categories. So core service are basically the highest frequency, longest span of service routes that RTD plans to offer, and these are just kind of guaranteed that they'll operate for an 18-hour span of service each day and have a 15-minute service offered or service offered every 15 minutes on weekdays in the peak and midday periods, which is a bump in service for many of the routes that will fall into the core category. Connect category routes are similar to core routes, but don't have quite the demand as those routes do. So they still have a long span of service each day, and just not necessarily the frequency. So many of them do have our plan to have frequent service in the peaks, especially, but others are planned to offer 30-minute service during the daytime and in the peaks. Commute routes are kind of specialized routes that focus on service to workplaces, which is generally downtown Denver and DEN Airport. And those routes will mostly operate in peak periods and serve those kind of unique destinations. And then finally, the community-focused routes, or the category we're calling community, are community-focused routes that are each one is unique, I would say, and they don't have the category itself doesn't have a defined span of service or frequency or anything like that. But the community routes can be anything really. I think a good example is the 16th Street Mall ride falls into the community category because it's a specialized service, but really it operates in very small locality in the downtown, and operates every 3 minutes with probably a 20-hour span of service, which is on par with the core services, but because it operates because of the environment in which it operates, it falls into the community category. So if we move on to the next slide here, and if you'll just advance it, Joel, it's going to bring up a map on the right side. So this first map here that came up, the red lines are the rail network, and the yellow lines are the community network. And then if you'll advance it again, it'll put the commute network on top there. Advance it to get the connect network, which fills in a lot of the areas. And then finally, if you advance to the core network, this is the proposed route network for the SOP. And on the left here, we have just some metrics about the categories of service. About 41% of the service hours fall into the core category, 40% in the connect category, and then 14 in the community, and then 5 in commute. And then just, I guess, just a couple notes about that. The service profile for the proposed SOP here is a flatter service profile. And what that means is it's actually more consistent service throughout the day. So instead of having big peaks in the AM and PM peak where we have twice as many buses out, I think before COVID we had 1.9 buses out in the peak for every 1 bus that we had out there in the midday. So this plans to bring that down, I think, to about 1.3. so that there's more service offered in the midday compared to the peak periods than there was previously. And that has the benefit for the transit passengers in that, we're offering more frequent service in the midday period, and also for our workforce in that having less of a peak results in fewer split shifts and which results in more straight shifts, which are more attractive to operators and should help to keep them around to retain them within the workforce. And then just one last note that this does better meet the needs of, or better meet the travel patterns of social equity groups within the district. As we mentioned, they've continued to ride much more frequently during the pandemic here than other groups, and this plan does increase the total amount of service that are offered to the equity groups.
Doug, just a note on timing. We've got 7 minutes left. I know you've got some calls to participate, but if we can have a couple minutes for questions as well.
Okay, I think Julie's going to take it from here.
You bet. In fact, actually, we can zip through a couple of these slides. So zip through, and I can share this. This is just some preliminary feedback we've received to date, and Joel has a copy of this. This is where this is the main point of this. So Doug, thank you so much for giving us the background. This is an online tool. You see the website on the top right. This is where we would love your feedback, and we would love your help getting word out about this. So we just launched this. There was a press release that went out today. We've done social media around it. So hopefully you'll be seeing this. This is a GIS-based tool that allows you to go on, click on your route, and provide us any comments you want. I've been monitoring the chat, and we've got tons of comments related to this route and that route and the frequency changing here. That is what we want to hear from you, and we would love it as part of this tool. So all you do is you click on the icon on the top left, and when you click on it, there's a splash screen that walks you through exactly how to put comments on. You can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can select any of the different types of services. You can organize it by your region. So this is the main reason we're here, is we would absolutely love your feedback and love for you to come on this tool and provide us all this feedback that we're getting in the chat about the different routes and things like that. With that, Joel, that is that we had a couple of other slides, but I think it's more important to give us a couple minutes for questions if you have any.
Great. Well, there was a lot of comments on how this was developed. And I know in other presentations you've gone into it. Chris Miller has what sounds like a very detailed question about the data used. Chris, if you have a way to summarize that, but help us understand the data that was used to predict the needs.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really you're getting data that will help you understand where people are coming and going to, and not really trying to say like where are people trying to drive to versus bus to versus bike to. How are you how are you evaluating the impacts on different equity groups, and is it a fine enough geographic granularity to help build out the sidewalk and bike lane part of the network?
So yeah, so we used the what we call the location-based services data, which is the cell phone data, and that was localized to the TAZs across the RTD district. So I think that's the level of granularity that we got down to on that. I think that's smaller than the neighborhood level, and I think that gives us a pretty good idea of where people are going from and traveling to. I don't think we have any intention of using it for building out the bike lane or sidewalk network, but I guess if Denver or somebody else is interested in that, I think we'd certainly be interested in sharing it with them if they feel that it would help their efforts.
Okay, we'll just get to a couple more here on the bigger picture. Money, right? So RTD is challenged with money, and this plan is kind of looking a few years out, but with some modest assumptions about return of revenue. and it's sort of fiscally constrained, but not to what we are bringing in today, but what we reasonably expect we might in a few years. John Rickey asks, are you panicked about the impending Tabor reinstatement affecting revenues?
That is an excellent question. And as you know, Joel, as part of the technical working group for Reimagine this morning, we actually presented our first piece of analysis of Tabor. So I guess the answer is yes, we are concerned, to the point that the chairman of the board, Vince Busick, actually announced that on the 25th, he is going to establish a working group within the board to evaluate this issue. The challenge is the decision point is 2024, and if RTD does not make a decision and it would actually require an election of the people by that time frame, then they will be subject to the Tabor provisions and will be required to refund some of those revenues. So yes, RTD is aware of it. They're taking it very seriously. They've got an internal working group they're just establishing, and as part of Reimagine, we are going to be providing them all the financial numbers, the assumptions moving forward, and what that could look like, and how much revenue would be involved. So that is part of our project as well.
Great. Antonio has a question about BRT and how that relates to this. Antonio?
Yes, I just want to know if you guys have either a percentage of how bus service would be, either drastically improved if we had a fully connected bus rapid transit network. I know that's something that's not really outside of your control and Denver control the streets, but have you guys said, hey, if we had this, we'll be able to improve our bus service by X amount? Has that conversation been had?
Not on that specific of a level. RTD, we finished the regional BRT feasibility study in 2019, and that covered, I think, most of the main core, probably 75% of the corridors were in Denver for that. But it was completed with the caveat that RTD, it was to be a guide. RTD didn't have money to implement that, and we're looking towards partnerships with municipalities or whoever controls the streets to try to implement that. So this plan is cognizant of that regional BRT feasibility study, but doesn't go so far as to take any major speed or reliability improvements from a BRT investment into the plan.
And perhaps the main difference between a corridor with a good bus on it and a BRT is not the bus itself, but changing the street to prioritize that. So it's that partnership. We're just about out of time. I'll just take one closing question here, and I hope you'll forgive me, David. I'll just paraphrase this. But I think it's an excellent one. So the system optimization plan is saying, with a reasonable assumption of revenues returning in the next handful of years, what is the network we would like to see? With all the data that was used to analyze this, of where people are coming from and going, and all the prioritization that was done on ridership and equity communities and the rest, have you modeled what network you would recommend on these same principles if you had twice as much money? Something that could really guide RTD, whether it's a windfall that comes in or a change in the state of how RTD is funded.
I know we have not modeled that yet, but as part of the mobility plan for the future, which I apologize, we ran out of time to get to talk about it, we are looking at a 2030 plan, and we are looking at a fiscally constrained plan and a needs-based plan. So the fiscally constrained plan will obviously be, assuming with what revenues we think that we could be in place, assuming no new sources. But the needs-based plan is going to be identifying all sorts of projects like the BRTs that we've been discussing and things like that, so that RTD has a tool and a mechanism to identifying those projects coming out. But Doug, to my knowledge, I don't believe we're looking at modeling, the ideal sort of scenario at this point.
We aren't. I think a lot of the challenges with COVID and the starts and stops of this plan for the last couple of years have led us to where we're at now. And yeah, I think we have ideas for that, but not it's not actually going to be any plan that's submitted. I think our bigger challenge right now is workforce rather than financial, so that this plan focuses on the more limited resources.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, it is great for those who are technically minded to see a plan that takes the principles and drives them through and says, what's a network that can give it to us? And I personally would love to see that guide the future, having seen a little bit too much of what happens when elected board members are fighting about, I want one over here, I want one over there, and maybe aren't having a plan that guides them in the future on the highly optimistic scenario where there's both more money and more operators. Thank you both for joining us tonight, and you're welcome to stay and respond to things we didn't get to in the chat. And I will stop sharing my screen so that I can introduce Herman Stockinger.
Thank you very much, and go on the tool. Go put your comments in. Thank you.
Please put the URL in the chat while I'm
absolutely
next speaker.
Happy to. Give me 1 second.
All right. Our final speaker this evening is Herman Stockinger. We had invited and had scheduled Shoshana Liu as Executive Director of CDOT. I got a call this morning that she had been called away on statewide business, but Herman Stockinger is on the executive management team for CDOT and works directly with Shoshana Liu. And if you've directly for Shoshana Liu, and is also staff, the board secretary, the secretary to the Transportation Commission. If you've watched what Herman is about to present unfold at the Transportation Commission with the greenhouse gas rulemaking, you'll have seen that Herman has been in the center of this the entire time. So we're very lucky to have you here. And I don't know if you have any slides to show or if this will just be verbal.
Just be verbal. I didn't realize I could have slides. Otherwise, I probably would have thrown some together, but hopefully this will work okay.
Welcome, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Apologies from Director Liu. Today was the state of the state and the second day of the session, and we're buried in meetings along those lines. So thanks for letting me fill in today. I'm happy to do it. Again, my name is Herman Stockinger. I'm the Deputy Director for CDOT, and as Joel said, I'm also the Secretary of the Transportation Commission and the Director of the Policy Office. And as such, I was pretty involved in the greenhouse gas rule this year that really is a historic thing for Colorado. So broadly put, what it's about climate change and the impact that it's having on Colorado. And things like poor air quality and drier soil and increased fire risk, more intense and frequent floods. Here at CDOT, we call it extreme weather and how we deal with those things on our highways, those fires, those floods. But for communities and neighborhoods, we recognize it goes beyond things like the fires that happened in Glenwood Canyon 2 years ago that resulted in the floods that happened last year that destroyed part of I-70. Climate change is contributing to heat-related respiratory illnesses, access to healthy food, clean water, and more. And in Colorado and nationally, transportation is now the biggest generator of these pollutants. So we are compelled at CDOT to try to do our fair share and do something about it. So what are we doing? I'm in a state where clearly, as we've seen this summer, the effects of climate change are being felt very acutely with massive fires and mudslides and high winds and drought. We can't sit around and do nothing, hoping that Washington or some other state is going to figure it out first and we can follow their lead. We're going to take a lead in this one. Our legislature and our governor pushed us to implement one of the most forward-thinking greenhouse gas standards in the nation, a standard designed to help reduce emissions in our state and give Coloradans more transportation options that we so desperately need. The standard at its core requires CDOT and our state's 5 metropolitan planning organizations, MPOs, to create transportation plans that essentially provide more travel choices, which will result in reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Here in the Denver area, as I think you all know, we have DRCOG, Denver Regional Council of Governments, that's our transportation planning entity. The other areas, the major metropolitan areas, Colorado Springs, the North Front Range area, Grand Junction, Pueblo, all have standards. And then for other parts of the state that are more rural, CDOT has a pollution reduction target that will cover the rest of the state as a whole. So those agencies and CDOT are working with sophisticated travel models that look at things like where people live and work, what developments are expected, how people travel, what kind of vehicle they're traveling in, how much congestion is on the road, and whether they'll utilize various travel options like the bus or light rail or bike pass. And then they make these determinations for different target years, 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050, to determine how much pollution is expected to result from these transportation projects, and then set goals for each of those areas. So the 5 MPO areas, and then the 6th area that CDOT covers that are in the non-MPO areas, specific goals for each of those areas. The modeling that we do applies primarily to what we call regionally significant projects, those large projects that really fundamentally change the way people travel. Projects like Central 70 or C470, or large new or expanded interchanges. If by doing that modeling, we can't meet the greenhouse gas reductions levels that are in this new reduction standard, we can choose to do what we call mitigation measures in the rule that are needed to help reduce greenhouse gas in a smaller way, but things like more transit, more bike paths, transportation demand management opportunities, cleaner construction policies, carpool programs, work from home programs, all sorts of smaller things we can do that'll make a difference, that'll get us to that reduction standard, which in 2030 is 1.5 million metric tons is the standard for the state that we need to reduce. And then if the agency, the MPOs or CDOT still can't meet the reduction standard that way, then the Transportation Commission of Colorado will restrict the use of some of those transportation funds we receive and that the MPOs receive, and we'll have to use those specifically for projects that do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the process we went through, as Joel kind of touched on, we reached out to Coloradans across the state for their feedback for months, and it really started last January. We worked with groups, the MPOs, the environmental groups, contractors, equity organizations that represented disproportionately impacted communities, which is dealt with a lot in this rule, local governments, and then of course, the owners of the rule, our Transportation Commission. We convened a greenhouse gas advisory group that met had stakeholders from across the state. We held 11 public rulemaking hearings, 5 joint state listening sessions with the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, Public Health and Environment, and held 60 smaller meetings around the state with our stakeholders. My office, the policy office, is in charge of our rulemaking processes, and I can say that this is by far the most comprehensive stakeholder effort we've had embarked on in updating one of our transportation rules. So we're really proud of the effort that we went through. And if you were following the process, we made significant changes to the rule along the way based on stakeholder feedback. So that was important to us. Just a couple other things, and I see there's some questions and thoughts coming in chat here, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. But we're expected to see some significant economic benefits for both members of the general public and for Colorado businesses. That comes primarily from the shift in mode choice and implementation of other efforts that'll help manage the transportation demand. With lower vehicle miles traveled, we'll see fewer crashes. We'll see savings in usage of gasoline, and perhaps most important, we'll see more travel options around the state, more bike paths, more focus on transit. It's the direction that CDOT has been headed for a while and really needs to head in order to improve the environment in Colorado. We talk about congestion on the roads and pollution in the air, and those are things we need to deal with both of those things. And then lastly, just to touch on disproportionately impacted communities, we're required now with this to, when we update our transportation plan, to really include a detailed analysis on the impacts of transportation to disproportionately impacted communities. Our state plan will work with disproportionately impacted communities more than ever before, and the greenhouse gas rule will give essentially bonus points for making specific efforts for pollution reduction within those DI communities. So we're excited about that too. People ask, is this going to really make a difference in Colorado? That 1.5 million metric tons, which is the reduction target, hard to say, like, what is a million metric tons? It's the equivalent of 169 million fewer gallons of gasoline being used. It's the equivalent of taking 300,000 cars off the road for a year. So I think it's going to make a big difference. It's going to change the way we think about transportation planning and then the way we execute transportation projects. So with that, I'll stop and take a look and see what we have in chat. And Joel, I don't know if you want to manage that, or if you want me to run through them, or however you want to do it. I'm up.
I'll tee up the questions, but if we can start with kind of what's next. When we've talked with environmental groups and COPERG, they're very enthusiastic about the way this rule turned out, but they've also been clear that this rule by itself doesn't do anything. It's the project selection, it's the relook at the 10-year plan. It's using what this rule directs in terms of greenhouse gas production reduction as well as mitigation. That's where the action's at. That's what makes the difference. Can you tell us about what's next along those lines?
Sure. Yeah. First off, the state statute that requires us to do this rule, Senate Bill 260, had a provision that requires CDOT and our 2 MPO areas that are in non-attainment, federal air quality non-attainment. Denver region is one of those, to update our transportation plans by October 1st of this year. So we are deep in our 10-year planning. Well, deep. We're in the first few months of our 10-year planning process, where we are updating our 10-year plan. And what that looks like is there may be projects that that Floyd Hill, we need to build some managed lanes on Floyd Hill, both directions, to move traffic easier. But the change that we'll be making in a corridor like that is we're going to mitigate the heck out of it. And there's micro transit that we're planning on the corridor, other things we're planning on the corridor to mitigate any negative impacts from air quality. We'll also have more focus on transit, bike paths, and we'll also take a hard look at the projects that are in the plan. Some of those may be pushed out, some of them may not happen, but the core of our 10-year plan stays in place, but we're going to do a lot more mitigation than what we had been doing before. I think the same probably is true for the DRCOG area.
Will projects that had been planned in the 10-year plan potentially drop off because they aren't moving the needle in the right direction?
It remains to be seen. Potentially that's the case. That's up to working with our planning partners. Again, in the Denver metro area, we have some projects that if Denver, if DRCOG don't see corridors that we have in place as big priorities for whatever reason, including certainly air quality is one of those big ones, then we might move to do something different in that corridor. So yeah, it's possible that we'll make some changes.
Okay, we'll move to some questions here. And as always, we're going to treat our guests politely, but there's really engaged folks on this call who have their burning questions. We'll start with an early question that came in from David Mincer about Director Liu being on record about what this will and won't do. David?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, she was pretty clear that they will be kind of proceeding full steam ahead with the planned highway expansions. And I'm thinking particularly of I-25 through Sun Valley as the poorest neighborhood in Denver. I don't see how adding bus lanes or bike lanes will mitigate the effect of that highway through that community. So I'm curious if there will be a re-examination of the need for that, and maybe taking the 1.5 billion and putting it really towards the community there.
Yeah, well, great question. I don't know exactly what Director Liu said. We are committed to the 10-year plan, but like I said, and be honest, got to be careful with what I say, because we have our planning partners. We have the City of Denver, we have Dr. Cog, and most importantly, we have our transportation commissioners that'll make the decisions over the next 6 months or so, what projects are in and out. And one of those things that we'll do is we're going to be running air quality conformity. And if we're not making it, then we're going to have to make some changes to the plan. Could one of those be I-25 and Central Denver? Potentially, yeah.
Chris Miller wants to talk a little bit about modeling for the second time tonight.
I've got my niche, and thank you for coming tonight. And
sure.
There are a lot of key, I guess, dependencies on a few different types of models within the greenhouse gas rule, and things like EV adoption assumptions. And over the past year, there's been a lot of back and forth on the accuracy of those models, particularly between CDOT and RMI. In the past, CDOT hasn't really, they've rebutted our data that others have presented without bringing data themselves. And I'd like to ask, going forward, will CDOT commit to publishing and centering how accurate those models are, which feed into the greenhouse gas rule and targets?
For sure, all of our information that we use to develop the results will need to be published on our website. So for sure, that's the case. The modeling, trying to remember all the pieces of what you said there. Certainly, we will have those available. One of the things that you mentioned, that the reliance on the EV adoption. So just to be clear, there's, our greenhouse gas roadmap in Colorado has a long list of things that we need to do to reduce greenhouse gases. The largest, the most impactful of those is EV adoption. And that will be a significant piece to the puzzle if we can reach that, 90% of EVs by, I think, 2030, 2035. But our greenhouse gas rule it's separate from the EV adoption. So we recognize that we expect EV adoption to happen, but that doesn't change the transportation planning that we need to do. Whether we build certain projects, whether we do mitigations for certain projects, the EV adoption is separate from that. Now, certainly when Dr. Cog and CDOT and others run our models, we'll be looking at what the expected EV adoption is in the different planning years, and maybe that's what you're referring to. And I have to rely on the experts of our model, and I suspect you're have more expertise in that than I do. But the EV adoption is a little different from our transportation planning.
Okay, so there's the interesting financial question. Jake Cohen, you had an idea about budget and VMT.
Yeah, a lot of these items are listed as mitigations for greenhouse gases. When really thinking about the department's function as the Department of Transportation, in a lot of these regions, we have mode shares that are heavily non-car based that could actually help mitigate if we invested into them at the same proportion that they are the mode share. I was curious if, instead of looking at those as mitigation factors, if CDOT has explored those as primary functions of its department and adjusting the budget accordingly.
Yeah, good question. And to clarify, when I talk about mitigation measures, because at various times throughout the rulemaking process, we were we were told, and we agree that doing the right thing isn't a mitigation measure. It's just the right thing to do for that road. So when I talk about mitigation measures, I talk about it in the context of, in the rule, there's things that you can model that are big, impactful things, and then there's smaller mitigation measures. But that TDM effort, that bike path, that new transit route are things that we would have done anyway, and we would have wanted to do anyway. We are certainly making some changes in our budget. And I think a few years ago, the start of Bustang is a great example of that. Our focus on revitalizing main streets is a new program that we're very proud of. The Multimodal and Mitigation Options Fund, we have new pots of money. Some of the new fees in Senate Bill 260, we made sure that those were flexible dollars, unlike our base state gas tax dollars that right now we can't use for transit. We made sure that those other dollars are more flexible and we can flex them to other modes like transit, and we do intend to do that.
Perry Burnap, who co-chairs Interneighborhood Cooperation Sustainability Committee, has a question about the reduction levels.
Good evening. Thanks for your presentation. You may have touched on this and I may have missed it, but I'm just wondering what the precise emission standards are in this new rule in terms of percentage as well as year, targeted year.
Yes, I can't give you percentages, but I can give you the target years and then the levels of reduction. So in the and I don't know if you want, okay, I'll give you DRCOG, the Denver area, and then statewide. And then I can give you more precise if you want it for the other areas. So for DRCOG, we start in 2025. A couple of the other areas of the state that don't already have federally required air quality modeling, they don't have to hit a reduction target until 2030, gives them some time to ramp up their modeling capabilities. But for DRCOG, the first year is 0.27 million metric tons in 2025. In 2030, it's 0.82 million metric tons. In 2040, 0.63 million metric tons. In 2050, 0.37 million metric tons. And I'll speak to why that goes down in a minute, and it may play into one of the comments we've gotten on the chat that I haven't fully read, but goes into the EV conversation. But then total statewide 2025 reduction. So all of the MPOs and then CDOT 0.43 million metric tons. 2030 is a number that a lot of the environmental groups really focused on and really pushed us to keep at 1.5 million metric tons statewide by 2030. So that's in the rule. 2040, it'll be 1.2 million metric tons. And then in 2050, it's 0.7 million metric tons. And the reason why it goes down, from 0.82 in 2030 to 0.63 in 2040 to 0.37 in 2050 is because we're dealing with, vehicle miles traveled and the movement of cars and the level of pollution that those cars emit. And we do have some aggressive EV penetration goals that when we get to 2050, if we have the EV penetration that we hope to have, then the reduction in vehicle miles traveled will be less impactful in 2050 because those cars, those miles that we're taking off the road, by and large, are already electric miles taken off the road, which of course don't have the pollutions that the internal combustion engines have. So I hope that answered your question and maybe touched on one of the other ones that we had.
Yeah, I won't tag on to that. There are so many other good questions. Thank you for that.
Okay, you bet.
Thank you. Where can we learn more about what's in here and why it's in here? The link that I sent out was to the red line of the rule. So if one is interested in reading the rule, you can see what changed, but that's pretty tough going. Is there a presentation that says, here's the high points, here's what's important about this? So I can share that with everybody?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have a few things that we can send. Fact sheets, some frequently asked questions. I'd be happy to forward you all that information.
Great. Now, we haven't touched on land use much. John Hersey has a great formulation of a question in those regards.
Thank you, Joel. John Hersey is at the gym, so I apologize for the basketball in the background. Certainly, CDOT has a lot of thoughtful strategies for the transportation side, but of course, transportation is inextricably linked to land use. And it just so happens that transportation and development have the two highest emissions out of the emissions pie. So how does CDOT plan to complement its pretty good innovation on transportation with pursuing land use?
Great question. We do reference land use a bit in the rule. We think that there'll be some incentives for land use decisions that are that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If you have this reduction goal and you're approving land use that is going to increase it, then you could have your funds restricted. So we think that there's something there that will be helpful. I would say CDOT in general, and I noticed that Nathan Lindquist is on the call. He is our new and first land use specialist coming out of Rifle, Colorado, and is working for us and working the land use issues for us. So Nathan, I don't know if you have the desire to chime in, but you're welcome to do that if you'd like.
Wow, you called me, Herman.
I saw you were on.
Yeah, I've been trying to get more plugged in to what's going on. Hi, everybody. I'm Nathan Lundquist. Yeah, as Herman said, we're developing some incentives. There's going to be a bill in the legislature soon that we're partnering on with DOLA and the Colorado Energy Office, and been working with Will Tour's team quite a bit to come up with a grant program that would incentivize better land use patterns. And so we're trying to connect that to transportation as much as possible. It's tricky though. I think on the whole, like you said, transportation and land use are so tied together, and the sprawling land use patterns we're seeing around the state make it hard to, when you design transportation projects, not take that into account. So I think the changes in land use and the changes in transportation do have to go hand in hand. So it's something we're starting to tackle in a variety of different planning forms around the state. But it's one of those things that's best done on the ground and regionally, and every region of the state's very different, whether it's urban or suburban or mountain. And so we've kind of got to tackle it, dealing with what we've got and trying to improve it from there. So, but it's definitely a really exciting time to be a part of CDOT and getting to work on this topic.
And Nathan, do I understand correctly, you'll be working with Denver and other municipalities on key CDOT-owned arterials?
Right, I'll be working on a project in Denver. We're calling the Urban Arterial Study, and we'll be trying to come up with kind of a long-term plan for several of the state highways in the Denver region, and hopefully do it in a way that focuses more on the land uses around the state highway and how we can support multimodal and connect to what the city of Denver is doing.
To avoid car trips with better land use and better street design.
Exactly.
Great. I'm sorry to cut you off here. We're just about out of time. Herman, I'll pick one more question here that leads to the next steps. You know, the project reprioritization, project reselection, and the 10 years and beyond. There's a question here. I've got to scroll up to find it. David Mincer, just to pick one project and poke at it to see if it's not intuitive. David, do you want to ask your question about Floyd Hill?
Sure. Yeah, there may be a technical question, but the modeling for Floyd Hill compared, you're adding the extra lane to no action, and it said that adding the extra lane will reduce VMT. And anyone who's ever given up a trip to the mountains because traffic is so bad kind of knows kind of intuitively that can't be true. And it makes me concerned that this is all based on modeling and mitigation. If the models aren't correct, it's not going to work. So I wonder if you can speak to that model or maybe get back to us on how they came to that conclusion.
Yeah, I'd be happy to get back with you on that conclusion. I've heard that too instinctively. I agree. It doesn't make much sense to me. I don't go to the mountains. When I do, I'll take a different highway. I don't go up I-70 because I don't want to deal with the traffic. So, I've learned over the course of the year and working with others at CDOT on this rule that induced demand is real, and I understand it and I can explain it a bit. And it seems odd that that's how that model was run. And I don't know what year that was done. And I don't know the details of it. I would say that we recognize that that's a project that, this is a balanced approach, and that one's going to be built. But we're going to try to make sure that we give other travel options along the corridor to make it better. But I can't disagree with you on that one. It seems odd to me as well that there isn't a larger induced demand factor on the expanding Floyd Hill.
Great. Well, this is going to be an interesting few months as things reprioritize public involvement in that. We're looking for those opportunities and hopefully course correction. If you've been monitoring the chat, we as always didn't get to everything, but I think you'll pick up on a certain amount of concern about how much weight is being put on EV adoption. And if those targets aren't hit, does that change all the equation in the critical, this year is always more critical than next year because all of this compounds. But thank you for staying with us, and we hope to be working more with CDOT and shortening the distance between our communities and the folks in agencies and departments doing the work that matters so much to our environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that, and we'd love to continue working with you. And I hope over the course of time, and as you see us develop the 10-year plan, we may always, to some, feel like we're going too far on the environmental side, and there's going to be some that feel like we are the Colorado Department of Driving. I hope over time you'll see that we're making our level best effort to improve air quality in Colorado to reduce the vehicle miles that are out there. This administration, this executive director, and I and the rest of the department are really focused on that. And I hope that those that have that opinion will change it over the course of time, but that's for us to try to make that happen.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Nathan, for introducing yourself as well. We've reached the end of our agenda. Please watch out for our notice that'll go out when this is posted on YouTube, and we will also include links to things that were mentioned today and the presentations from the two groups that had slides to show us. We will be back in 2 months. We meet every other month on the second Thursday of the month, and already confirmed for our next meeting in March is the new executive director of DOTI, Adam Phipps, and it's on his schedule. So we will get to meet him as we have done every time there's somebody new heading Public Works or DOTI, we get them on the calendar right away. Thanks for being here and take care.